Basics of videography. Let's explore the world of video making and editing. Welcome to this comprehensive video about video making and editing. In this video, we'll cover everything you need to know to get started with video making, from choosing the right camera and lenses, to using software like Premiere Pro, iMovie, Final Cut Pro, and DaVinci Resolve. Cameras and lenses. First, let's talk about cameras and lenses. Everybody nowadays have a phone capable of capturing fine-looking videos, but if video quality is important, you can step up while remaining on a budget, investing in a mirrorless, a DSLR or a small video camera. When buying a camera, you'll want to consider factors such as sensor size, resolution, and frame rate. Additionally, it's important to choose the right lens for the type of video making you plan to do. The camera and lens you use can greatly impact the look and feel of your video, so it's important to choose the right equipment for your needs. If you're working with a limited budget, consider renting a camera and lens, as this can be more cost-effective than purchasing new equipment. When choosing a lens, consider the focal length and aperture. A fast, wide-angle lens can help you capture more of the environment and create a sense of space, while a longer lens can help you achieve a shallow depth of field and isolate your subject. You can also use different lens focal lengths to create different perspectives and add visual interest to your shots. Exposing your shot. Exposure in photography and videography refers to the amount of light that reaches the camera's sensor or film, and it is a crucial aspect of creating an aesthetically pleasing image. The three key elements of exposure are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Correctly exposing a photo or a video requires balancing these three elements to achieve the desired effect. Shutter speed. Shutter speed determines the amount of time the camera's sensor or film is exposed to light. A slow shutter speed allows more light to reach the sensor, creating a brighter image, while a fast shutter speed allows less light in, resulting in a darker image. Slow shutter speeds are useful for capturing motion or when shooting in low light conditions, while fast shutter speeds are helpful for freezing action or when shooting in bright light. For now, we'll keep it simple and we'll set a shutter speed of 1/50th a second, which is the standard shutter speed for videos. Aperture. One of the key elements of video making is aperture. Aperture refers to the size of the hole in the lens that allows light to enter the camera. By controlling the aperture, you can control the amount of light that enters the camera, which in turn affects the exposure and the depth of field of the shot. The aperture of your lens is important, as it can impact the amount of light entering the camera and the depth of field in your shots. Consider using a lens with a wide aperture to achieve a shallow depth of field and create a soft, blurred background. This can help to isolate your subject and create a more cinematic look. However, you'll need to be careful when using a wide aperture, as this can make your shots more susceptible to camera shake and blur, and they will be more prone to be out of focus. To avoid this, consider using a tripod or stabilizing rig, or simply closing the aperture a little bit. ISO. ISO refers to the sensitivity of the camera's sensor or film to light. A higher ISO value results in a brighter image, while a lower ISO value results in a darker image. However, increasing the ISO also increases image noise or grain, making the image appear less sharp. It's essential to find a balance between the ISO value and the shutter speed and aperture settings to achieve the desired exposure. In conclusion, correctly exposing a photo or a video involves balancing the three elements of exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. It requires a good understanding of the relationship between these elements and how they affect the final image. A photographer or videographer must also consider the lighting conditions, subject matter, and desired creative effect when adjusting these settings. Going deeper into exposure, it's important to understand how the camera's light meter works. The light meter is a device that measures the amount of light in a scene and provides an exposure value to the photographer or videographer. The camera uses this value to determine the appropriate combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to achieve a correct exposure. There are two main types of light meters: center-weighted and spot meters. Center-weighted meters measure the average light in the scene, giving more weight to the central area of the frame. Spot meters, on the other hand, measure the light in a very small, specific area of the scene, typically 1 to 2% of the total frame. Spot metering is useful for metering off a specific part of the scene, such as a subject's face, to ensure that it is correctly exposed. Exposure compensation is another important aspect of exposure. This allows the photographer or videographer to adjust the exposure value recommended by the camera to achieve a desired effect. For example, if the camera recommends an exposure that results in an underexposed image, the photographer or videographer can increase the exposure compensation to brighten the image. Another important aspect of exposure is dynamic range, which refers to the range of brightness values that the camera can capture in a single image. The human eye has a much greater dynamic range than a camera, meaning that the camera may not be able to capture the full range of brightness values in a scene. To overcome this, photographers often use techniques such as bracketing or high dynamic range (HDR) photography to extend the camera's dynamic range and capture more detail in both the highlights and shadows of a scene. In conclusion, exposing a photo or a video correctly involves a deep understanding of the camera's light meter, exposure compensation, and dynamic range, as well as the relationship between shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. By mastering these elements, a videographer can achieve the desired exposure for their images and create visually stunning and impactful scenes.